So I've had several consultations, and it's actually like very, I don't know, like discouraging, I think defeating sometimes when I'm talking. Most of the time they're women, and they are basically explaining that they're unhappy in their marriage, not getting along, husband's working all the time or traveling all the time or whatever, and they want to get a divorce. Most of the time they have pretty, lavish lifestyles when I'm talking to them, and they drive the $2,000, $3,000 vehicles, and they live in really nice houses, and they have really nice purses and trips and all those things. And when I'm talking to them, and I have to explain to them, like, listen, spouse was born in Texas. It's pretty difficult to come by, and you're probably going to have to adjust your lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean,
forward.
We've talked about it before on podcasts with the gray divorce, right? We're seeing a lot of those. And so with a lot of that stuff, when you have, particularly older women that have been stay-at-home moms and all that stuff, haven't been the breadwinners. Now looking at going through a divorce, how are they going to live, right? Because they're really too old to go start a career, right?
I don't think you're ever too old to start a career.
At 85, can you start a new career?
Maybe. I don't know. There's
Probably
some pretty
not.
fantastic 85-year-old women that I've met. But no, it is way more difficult. And, those are, we'll get into it here in a little bit, but talking about the different factors. And it's very, very kind of discouraging. It's very concerning. And I've had, consultations where, the parties that maybe the husband earns like a whole bunch of money each month, but they have always lived paycheck to paycheck, and they don't have a whole lot of assets in the bank. They don't have property to sell. They don't have, investments or 401ks. And so literally the only thing that they have is the husband's income. And to explain to her, like, listen, if you walk away from this, you could be potentially walking away with nothing because y'all don't have anything.
Yeah, so why don't we tell the people a little bit about it, right? So welcome to the consultation. My name is Josh Floyd. I'm here with Christina Jimenez. We are both attorneys here at Jimenez Law Firm. And as you can tell, today we're going to be discussing, spousal maintenance and kind of what the process is and eligibility and how people like what we've been discussing can survive post-marriage.
Well, if they can survive, or like what you probably need to consider if this is something that you may be looking into or thinking about, right? And so sometimes, and I've had those consultations too, right, where people are just like, I don't care if I'm going to be broke. I don't care if I'm not going to receive spousal maintenance. I really just need to get myself out of this marriage, and I'll figure out the rest of the stuff later on, right? So let's talk about who is eligible to receive spousal maintenance, because not everybody is going to be eligible to receive it.
Okay, that's a good idea.
So what's like the first thing that we would have to prove in court?
Well, so you go at it a few different ways, right? So
go ahead.
So you'd have to prove that you're a victim. Well, I guess there's one overarching.
Yes.
Okay. We'll go over that. So I didn't get the wink right to figure out where you were going with that question.
Who do you have to be in order to be able to apply for spousal?
You have to be
maintenance.
A broke spouse.
So not necessarily a broke spouse. You just have to be a spouse. In order, that's like the first.
Well, you have to be broke.
Factor that we have to determine, because not everybody is always a spouse. I know that seems like it's very simple and very common sense, but we have
That's probably why I didn't answer your question. What do you have to be? Broke.
We have
a spouse.
A lot of people who
that needs maintenance, maybe?
Yeah, that they need money. And once we start looking through and kind of investigating and talking to them, they have this perception that perhaps they're common law married, and they've been common law married for all of these years. And then once we start going through and determining the factors of common law marriage, we figure out, well, maybe you're not even going to be able to meet that first hurdle, which is, are you a spouse, right? And so I think we have a whole other podcast just on common law marriage, and so we're not going to dive into all of that, but it is definitely something that we're going to look into before even talking to you about spousal maintenance, Floyd. Okay, so You want to talk about minimum reasonable needs?
We can talk about minimum reasonable needs. I think we've, off the record, had long discussions about what is minimum reasonable needs, and we don't agree. But so I believe it means just that, right? The least amount of money necessary to provide for your food, clothing, and shelter, right? So can you live, right? I know that you've taken the position of, well, if they're used to getting their nails done every week, then that's important. That's not. But so minimum reasonable needs is, can you feed, clothe, house yourself? That's my opinion on it.
So I understand what you're saying, and to some extent I do agree, but
that means she disagrees.
To some extent I agree,
and to some extent you disagree.
I disagree. And the reason why I disagree is because I think that minimum reasonable needs are going to differ based on the individual, right? So sometimes we have clients who are driving around a brand new $2,300 vehicle, right? That is not the minimum that somebody...
Monthly payment?
Yeah, monthly payment. Okay. $2,300 monthly payment.
A $2,300 vehicle is not very lavish.
So if
maybe when you bought your first car, that was
probably what I said, actually. But so that is what they need each month just to maintain that vehicle payment. That's not bare minimum. That's not, something that a lot of people have, but that is what they have grown accustomed to, right? Sometimes we have clients who are living in a 10,000 square foot house and they need, $1,000 a month to be able to pay that electric bill. That is something that the courts can potentially consider to say, these are part of your reasonable monthly needs, whereas, another woman down the street may only need $200 to pay for electricity or $500 to pay for her monthly bill. I think where we kind of get into the disagreements are things like the hair and the nails and the yoga studios and, all of those things. And frankly, I think it depends on your judge, right? And most of the stuff, when we're talking about this stuff on podcasts, it all depends on who your judge is, because there's lots of judges who would say, you're getting divorced, too bad, right? You're not going to have those things. There are other judges that will say, well, this is what you've been accustomed to. This is what you've been doing for the past 15 years. Sir, this is how she's been living. We're going to continue to maintain that at least for a certain time frame.
And to be clear, I think what we're talking about today is post-divorce spousal, right? Not temporary spousal. And I think I know the burdens are completely different. And kind of what you're talking about is a $2,300 car payment, right? I think that's dealt with at temporary, or should be, right? Maybe they get more spousal support or spousal maintenance at temporary orders, right? So they can get rid of the car and get themselves in a position that post-divorce they can provide for their minimum reasonable needs. And if they choose to keep a $2,300 car, they don't need spousal maintenance.
That's your opinion.
I agree.
And that's what I said. That you don't, it has to be considered. Are they eligible to trade in this vehicle, right? Do they have negative equity in this vehicle so that it would actually be disadvantageous to the community? Is that a word?
I don't know, but we're going to use it. Go with it. Disadvantageous.
It would not be advantageous to the community to trade in that vehicle, right? And so there's other things that we have to consider. We can't just say, oh, it's $2,300. That's not reasonable, so now she's not going to get post-divorce spousal, right? I think that you have to, especially when you're diving into spousal maintenance, post-divorce spousal maintenance, there are so many different things that the courts are going to consider when determining what is in fact reasonable, right? So two of the things that the courts are going to look at is, the first is property. Like when you get a divorce, what property are you walking away with and how is that property structured, right? So, if you're walking away with, hypothetically speaking, a $500,000 home, and maybe that's your equity in the home, and you're walking away with $5,000 in cash, right, or some sort of liquid asset, the court may be inclined to give you spousal maintenance because you may not have enough income to pay for your minimum reasonable needs, right?
Yeah, and that kind of differs from if you're walking away with a $500,000 interest in a 401k, right? Because the courts, they're not going to require you to make a move that's going to hurt you financially. Like withdrawing that's going to cost you a bunch of money, right? And so they're not going to say, well, you got 500,000 in 401k, you can withdraw, so you don't need maintenance, right? But liquid assets, like you were talking about, are going to be considered.
And again, I think it depends on the court, right? Because I think that there are some judges that would say, well, you have 500,000 in 401k, so now you can liquidate that, or you have a $500,000 home, you can sell it, right? But that's part of your attorney's, job, is to go in and to be able to argue why that would not be reasonable for the court to order that you do those things, right? Like, we have this house and we have minor children, and maybe these children have been in the school district for years and years, and we want to make sure that they stay there for the next 5 years. Maybe we have a CPA, or we have our client testify as to the tax consequences if they were to liquidate that 401k account. So when we're looking at these things and we're trying to structure or set the case up for potentially receiving post-divorce spousal maintenance, we're going to want to look at how are we setting up this property, or what are we going to ask for in property, and are we going to present it in such a way where we can go in and argue for spousal maintenance?
Yeah, and if you know that that's something that they're going to use, the fact that you're getting, since we're using that example, 500,000 401k, and the other side's going to argue, well, they don't need spousal maintenance because they're getting this, right? What you talked about CPA is going to be very important, right? Because what you want the court to see is, I'm not getting 500,000, right? It's going to cost me 100,000 to get it out. So instead of viewing me of having 500, I'm only getting 400, right? And so I think that's important to lay out for the court and considering the division.
Right.
But we're not talking about division today.
We are not. So one of the biggest things that we do whenever we have a client that we've determined, okay, a post-divorce spousal maintenance or temporary spousal maintenance is likely going to be needed in this case, is we do what we call a financial information statement. Okay, and so essentially, and I do a couple, I think you do too. So I do one for the husband and I do one for the wife. And in our examples, most of the time we're going to be talking about the wife receiving spousal maintenance, because that's just typically how it goes. We've had some.
But we have gotten some men's spousal maintenance.
We have. But
Michelle, watch out.
Whatever. But most of the time it's the wives that need the spousal maintenance. And so we will go through and we'll do a financial information statement for the wife to say, okay, how much money do you make, and what are all of your bills, all of your expenses, and do you actually need money each month to help you pay for those bills, right? And when we do this, we're talking all bills, right? Like minimum credit card payments, rent, electric, vehicles, insurance, anything and everything that we can think of that our clients might have to spend is going on that list if we're the one that's requesting the spousal maintenance, because we need to be able to show the judge, we need this money, right? Now for the husband, if he was going to potentially be the one paying, what are we doing?
Same thing, right? Well, so do we represent wife?
Well, yeah, let's say we represent.
If we represent wife when we're doing the husband's financial information statement, we're not going to be as inclusive. We'll include what we know about, right? But we want to make it look like he has more money, right? If we represented the husband on the other side fighting against it, obviously we'd add everything in to show that he doesn't have enough money to pay post-divorce spousal maintenance.
And that's what, the lawyers are going to do. So when husband's attorney comes in, right, he's going to have every little, nitpicky thing in there to say, nope, he doesn't have enough money, judge. Or maybe at the end of paying all of his expenses, he has $500, and so we'll give that to the wife, but we can't afford to give anything more than that, right?
Right.
So, one of the things that I'll do a lot of times whenever I know, like, I'm representing the husband and I think, okay, we're probably going to get hit with something, either temporary or post-divorce. If I know that there is an asset that my client is on the hook for. So hypothetically speaking, the house, the mortgage is only in his name. Sometimes I will say, as post-divorce spousal or as temporary spousal, you're going to be obligated to pay that mortgage payment, as opposed to giving her cash directly, because I want to make sure that we're protecting your credit and that lien is paid until such time as the residence is sold or refinanced or whatever.
Yep, I agree.
Okay. So next is the statutory basis for maintenance and how you.
So you have to be a spouse.
Good job, Floyd. You finally nailed it. Good job. And then the next is smart ass. The 10 years plus inability.
Yes.
Do you want to explain it?
Sure.
I feel like I'm talking a lot.
You usually do. So I'll just talk about the 10 years one.
Okay.
So you have to be married at least 10 years and not have the ability to provide for your minimum reasonable needs, although we don't really know what that is. But so 10 years marriage and
diligent effort on a temporary basis.
So you're going to go to the presumption.
Well, I guess you can call it presumption, but this is something that you're going to have to prove at final.
Right. So there's a presumption that you should not receive spousal maintenance if you have not exercised diligence in trying to earn sufficient income to provide for your minimum necessities, or haven't exercised diligence in obtaining the education or skills necessary so that you can provide for your minimum reasonable needs. So what Christina was saying is that final, you're not only going to have to prove your need, right, but that you've also exercised diligence in trying to solve that yourself without just relying on your spouse to provide maintenance.
Yeah, so, the 10 years is easy. The financial information statement to show earnings, like what you make, and then your expenses, and then, I don't have enough to pay for all this stuff. Those are obviously easier.
So the 10 years is easy in a formal marriage, but we've battled that in informal marriage, common law marriages.
Yes. That was that fun case in Dallas, remember?
Yes.
That was, okay, so I'm going to tell this little story because
she likes to talk a lot.
I like to tell stories. And so we had, this was actually a husband that we were representing in that particular case. And in that case, it was an informal marriage, and these people had been together for like 20-something years. And the wife had structured a lot of LLCs, and they were actually pretty successful. She had structured some LLCs. Everything was put in her name. And he was kind of just oblivious, just kind of going through life and trusting his wife, as he probably should have. And once she files for divorce, she comes in and she basically says, we've only been married for like 5 years or something like that. And I think that she had been filing individual returns, and maybe he hadn't been filing returns. There was something or maybe we couldn't get the tax returns 10 years back. There was some issue with that. I don't remember either. But we, in that particular case, had to start pulling. I remember our client found a poster from about 15 years ago where they had been in some sort of a festival, and it had their pictures and it had Mr. and Mrs., right? We had to go in and we had to pull medical records from when he had gone to an emergency room, and she had filled out the paperwork and she had listed him as spouse.
And I think there was like a Valentine's card that said, to my husband or something, just all kinds of little crazy stuff like that.
Yeah. And in that case, even his own children were against him. Remember, they wouldn't come in and testify that their parents were actually married. And so we had to get very, very creative to prove the 10 years in that particular case. And we did, thankfully. And the inability to earn income, that was an easy one in that particular case because she took everything and everything was in her name. And so the one that I think a lot of attorneys forget is the diligent effort to earn sufficient income or to develop skills. I think a lot of attorneys just think, oh, well, you guys have been married this long, you're good to go. And oh, you don't have enough money, we're going to be able to prove this. And in the meantime, the spouse is just doing nothing on a temporary basis while the divorce is pending.
Trying to milk it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a factor, right? It's something that you, like Floyd said, it's a presumption that if you're not doing these things, you're not going to get it, right? So,
well, I think it's important. The relevant time frame for that is during separation, right? So they don't look at whether you were exercising due diligence during the marriage, right? But once you're separated during that period of time, are you doing what you can?
Right. And so, sometimes I will have clients who are like, listen, I've tried to get a job and I am only going to, earn $10 an hour and I can't, survive off of that. And so other times, I have clients who say, I can't afford to get a job because of my mental health issues or because perhaps I don't have the requisite skills because I've been out of work for 10 years and nobody wants to hire me. We've had clients who don't speak English, right? We have clients that didn't have a high school diploma and they didn't need it because they were just staying home. And so those are the cases where I really, really encourage people to go back to school. And it's tough, like very tough on people to kind of be like, oh gosh, I have to go and I have to like start this and I didn't want to do this. And
I'm 85.
And I'm 85. But you have to try, like you have to do it. Otherwise, there's a strong likelihood in good court, you're not getting spousal.
Yeah. And if you're going through this, your attorney should be advising you when you're applying for jobs, get copies of those applications.
Right.
I don't know how many times they've been like, my clients would be like, oh, I've applied for 7 positions. All right, give me the application so I can prove that.
Right.
Well, I don't have them. Okay, well, that makes it difficult. Right, now we're going to have to try to subpoena all these people to get them in to testify that you applied. Right. So just take a picture, get a copy of the application when you submit it that way, or screenshot it. I guess it's all online now.
Yeah, thank them for the interviews and a thank you email. Just something to show the court, like, listen, I have been trying and I just have not been successful for whatever reason.
And if you get offered a $10 an hour job, take it. Right, I understand it's not going to pay your bills. Right, but
bills. Go ahead, sorry.
Guess we're making fun of people's impediments.
Your bills also.
Well, it depends. It depends where you're from, right? So you'll show the court that you're exercising as much diligence as you can. So, and hopefully you won't get laughed at in court, and the other attorney won't make fun of you. I haven't been quite so lucky.
Okay, so do we want to move on to family violence?
I mean, that's always a fun topic.
Yeah. Okay. So if you guys haven't been married for 10 plus years, and even I guess if you have been married for 10 plus years, but a lot of times one of the things when this happens, it's normally a short marriage. It's at least whenever I've had to like use it or argue it.
It's like less than 10 years.
Less than 10 years, right. And that's if there's a claim based on family violence. And so do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Do it.
So, if you have not been married for 10 years, or if you have been married, no. So to get post-divorce spousal maintenance under family violence, you have to show that there's been a conviction or deferred for family violence that was committed against the other spouse or the spouse, child of the spouse, within the 2 years preceding the date you filed for divorce. And so if you can prove that, plus that you don't have sufficient income to earn minimum reasonable, or to provide for your minimum reasonable needs, then you're eligible for spousal.
Correct. So, yeah, I don't know that there's much more to talk about on that.
No, just that it has to be a conviction or deferred. Just, going in and saying, there's been family violence, but I didn't report it, right? That's not going to get you. If you've been married less than 10 years, that's not going to qualify you.
Right. And it has to be the spouse's child, right? So let's clarify that. It doesn't have to be a child born of the marriage.
No.
It just has to be, so if you're the wife and you're applying for the spousal maintenance and perhaps this is your child from a previous relationship and your husband did something to that kiddo, then that still would qualify.
Correct.
Easy breezy?
Lemon squeezy.
¿Qué más?
Disabled child.
Okay.
So if there's a disabled child, now this one does have to be born of the marriage.
Okay.
Right. So if one spouse is prevented from being able to go earn sufficient income because they're at home caring for a child that is disabled, that child is born of the marriage, it could be an adult child, right? Then they would be eligible for spousal support as well, spousal maintenance.
So did you say this? Because I kind of zoned out. But
you don't really listen, I know.
The parent, the spouses, has to provide substantial care and supervision to that child that prevents them from earning the income. You said that?
Yes.
Yeah. Good, well said.
Thanks.
Well said.
Mm-hmm.
And so the other thing that, and we probably need to talk about it for the last part as well, is, you know, when we're going through and we're looking at the financial information statement, a lot of these kiddos and or spouses are receiving some sort of disability, right? Some sort of benefits. Sometimes there's insurance that they're receiving as well. And sometimes they go and they live with family members, which we probably should talk about when we're looking at sufficient income to provide for reasonable needs, because that is something that comes in a lot. So when we're going through and we're doing that financial information statement, and let's say we're representing the husband, and the wife has moved in with her sister, and the sister is, has a nice big home, and she's maybe well off, and wife isn't having to pay any sort of rent or any sort of food or electric, or, maybe she's borrowing sister's car if she needs it. All of those things, what we're doing is we're going through and we're knocking off all of the expenses that wife has to be able to say, well, look, Judge, she only needs, $1,500 a month to live. And she receives that from disability, right? Or she receives that from insurance, or with the property that she's going to receive, she's going to have that amount to be able to live off of.
And on the inverse, we're arguing, she shouldn't be required to live with her family and borrow her mom's car, while the other spouse is out gallivanting. That's the word, gallivanting around with women. Yes, gallivanting around with women and living in a nice home and all that.
Right. So if we can meet one of those elements, requirements, 10 years, disability, family violence, then how long can a spouse receive?
It depends which criteria you meet.
Okay.
So if you meet the family violence, then it's 5 years. If you meet 10 years to 20, if you're married 10 to 20 years, if you get it based on that, then it's 5 years also.
Okay.
Do you want me to go through the whole list?
Yeah. Go do it.
Okay. If you're married 10 to 20 years, it's 20 to 30 years, then it's 7 years. And if it's 30 plus years, then it's 10 years. Now that's the max, right? That's not what you're automatically going to get. That's the most the court can award. If it's based on disability, then it can be for forever, right? As long as a disability prevents them from being able to work.
Yeah, and that whole thing that you're saying about that's the max, that is something that I have to stress to people all the time when we're prepping for trial or we're doing a consultation, is listen, that is the most that you're likely going to get, but a lot of times judges are not inclined to do it.
And I have a feeling at some point during this podcast we may discuss some factors that they will look at, but not yet.
I feel like no, it's not yet.
No, not time.
It's just not time.
I'm forecasting. Isn't that what it's called?
Foreshadowing?
Foreshadowing the casting of this.
And so keep that in mind.
So keep watching. That's the point. The factors.
And so how much are you going to be eligible to receive as a spouse? I guess let's talk about maximums, because we've already kind of talked about the financial information statement and how all that stuff works, but there's actually a limit. And so if you hypothetically need $10,000 a month to live, you may not be able to, or you will not receive that much, right? So
why is that? What's the limit?
5,000 or 20% of gross, whichever is lesser, right? The lesser of or the greater of. I always get confused on how to explain that. So you're capped at 5,000. You're not going to
Yeah.
receive anything more than that. And so even
So the
if
lesser of.
the lesser of, thank you. So if it's 20% and the 20% would be 10,000, you're still going to be capped at the 5.
Yes. And it's 20% of gross, right? Don't get that confused with like child support, which is based on net income. This is based on gross income.
Yeah. That kind of sucks. I always think that sucks. 20 years of marriage and you're capped at $5,000 a month. I guess it depends on who you're representing.
Right.
So, okay, so when you were foreshadowing.
You know what also is funny is I don't know that number's gone up in a very, 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 at least since I've been practicing 11 years. And certainly the cost of living has gone up a little bit.
Yeah, I know. It's
reach out to your legislature, see if you can do something about that.
Right.
Not right now. Finish watching the podcast first.
So, factors. Floyd was talking about the factors that the court can consider to determine how long and how much you receive. So, Floyd, you have a list there.
I do have a list because there's a long list in the code.
Okay, so do it. Go.
Okay, so some of this ties into things we've already talked about, but they'll look at the each spouse's ability to earn and provide for their minimum reasonable needs, obviously, but that's after dissolution. So what's your financial state going to be after the divorce is finalized? Education and employment skills, length of the marriage. And again, we're looking at length of the marriage here, not to determine whether you're eligible for spousal, right? But how much spousal and how long you should receive spousal for. Age, employment history, earning ability, physical, emotional condition. They look at one spouse's ability to provide spousal support and child support while paying other spouse support and child support. They also look at like abnormal expenditures by one spouse, like fraud or concealing property or gambling a bunch of money, prostitutes, cocaine, all the fun stuff. And then they'll look at one spouse's, like how much one spouse contributed to the earning and education of the other spouse, like during the marriage, right? Did you pay for them to go to school, right? That kind of thing. They look at what property each spouse brought into the marriage. They look at whether the spouse contributed as a homemaker, any marital misconduct or history or pattern of family violence. And with that one, it doesn't have to be a conviction, right? They can just look at whether there was family violence. Yeah.
So I always, whenever we're talking about spousal maintenance, I always think of a case, and we actually didn't go to trial. We settled at mediation, and we had, a good lawyer on the other side, and great mediator that mediated the case for us. And in that particular case, the marriage was, I think, 12 years. They had 2 minor kiddos. I think the eldest was 11 or 12. And when the parties were married, the wife was actually doing really well. She was making decent money. I actually think that she did help him complete his master's, like help pay for that. And when they had kiddos, she quit her job. And she decided she was going to stay home. And she is one of those like fantastic stay-at-home moms. Like the kiddos were involved in all sorts of activities. She was very active at the school, PTA president. She was one of those super moms, right? And during that time, she just completely said, I'm not going to focus on my career because, my husband has it. At this time, I think he was making like $300,000 a year, something like that. He ends up having an affair, comes to her, says, I want a divorce. And of course, we talk about the fact that you have to try to get a job in the interim, right, since separation. She starts looking, and even though she had a master's in finance because she had been out of the workforce, and I think when she had left her previous job 12 years prior, she was making over $100,000. She tries to go back, and she, I think, is offered like $50,000-$60,000 a year, something like that. And obviously that's pretty discouraging, pretty disheartening to her because she if she had stayed on that path during the marriage, she probably would have been making just as much, if not more, than what he was making, and she gave all that stuff up. And so we ended up walking away with, I think, over $1 million in assets. Plus, they agreed to provide post-divorce spousal maintenance. I want to say for the 5 years, it was 4 or 5 years post-divorce, because of all of those things that we just explained. And she was not going to let this thing go without that, because she sacrificed everything for him. And then he did what he did. So kind of just putting all that stuff together.
Thank you for that.
But it terminates too.
It does terminate.
Yeah.
It does terminate.
On remarriage. And guess what she did?
No, she didn't.
Right after the term, I think it was 4 years that she received it for, and like 4 years and 2 months, she got remarried.
No, that's okay. She milked it.
Yeah. So it goes away if you remarry. And so if she had remarried within a year, then she would not have received the rest of those payments. How else does it terminate?
If the person receiving the maintenance dies.
Yeah. What about the person paying the maintenance?
Yeah, if they die too.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. And then sometimes, is it in the code, cohabitation?
No, it's just on remarriage. But with cohabitation, you've got to be careful, because if you are accidentally common law married, right? If you file tax returns together as married, although you're not legally, formally married, go in and get that taken away.
Well, and I'll normally, especially if we're stipulating to, it's called something different, contractual alimony. If we're agreeing to it, and I'm representing the husband, a lot of times I will include certain provisions to say, okay, it's going to terminate on one of these events, and one of them is cohabitation, right? So if wife decides that she's going to shack up with another guy, well, my client doesn't need to be paying, spousal maintenance or contractual alimony. I'll do things sometimes on, based on the children. If certain things happen with the kiddos, then if kiddo goes and lives with the other parent, well, then now it's going to terminate. If mom gets a job, and she's earning X number of dollars, then it's going to terminate. There's all different ways, if you settle these cases at mediation, that you can put additional factors in to terminate. But the code says remarriage or death.
See.
Okay. Anything else that we're forgetting?
I think that's a wrap.
Okay. Well, as always, thank you guys for watching the consultation. We hope this provided some information. Like we always say, this is not to be construed as legal advice. If you find yourself in this position, we highly recommend that you find an attorney in your area that practices in your jurisdiction, that knows your judge. Consult with them, follow their advice. As always, please follow us on social media platforms. We have TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. If there's a platform, then Chandler makes sure that we are on it. So make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, do all those fancy things.